Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about, capitalism a little bit.
Right.
And we're looking at a section from What Went Wrong with Capitalism. A
Yes.
really, really interesting book that kind of digs into, what the title says, What Went Wrong with Capitalism.
Yeah.
So we're going to be specifically looking at kind of this idea of, how
Will.
the economy might not be as strong as
Right, it might seem.
it seems, even though the stock market is doing really well.
Yeah, I think the book calls this the productivity puzzle.
The productivity puzzle. Okay, so
Yeah.
help me understand that. What is a productivity puzzle?
Think about like a bakery, right?
Okay.
If a bakery's doing well every year, it makes more loaves of bread.
More loaves of bread, yeah.
And that means everyone gets a bigger slice,
Right.
everyone's benefiting.
Right, everyone gets more.
Right, but lately the bakery's been having trouble, it's making fewer loaves of bread.
Fewer loaves of bread, so
And that's the slowdown in growth that we're seeing.
it's like less bread for everyone. So why is the bakery making less bread?
That's a great question. So the baker's making less bread because each baker isn't making as many loaves per hour.
Oh.
And that's productivity.
Okay.
And so the book is highlighting how productivity growth has been really slow.
Okay, so even though we have like all this new technology and
Like
automation,
robots helping us.
the bakers are still
Making
less bread
making less bread per hour than they were, a few decades ago.
than they were back in the day.
Yeah, back when things were simpler.
So that's weird, right?
It is weird, and the book suggests a kind of a surprising culprit for this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the growing size of government.
Okay, the government's getting in the way of the bakers.
As governments get bigger, they tend to, introduce more regulations, spend more money, take on more debt, and that can create roadblocks for businesses.
So is the idea here that like more government equals slower growth? Because
That's what the book is suggesting.
it's like bugging everything down.
It's adding friction to the system.
Okay, no, but I mean, isn't the government also supposed to help the economy?
Yeah, that's
Like,
absolutely.
That's kind of their whole job, right?
Of course.
To provide a safety net and
Yeah.
make sure things are fair.
So there's a balance to be struck.
Okay.
Right, we need government. We want government.
Right.
But we don't want so much that it starts to strangle the economy.
Okay, so let's go back to the bakery analogy.
Right.
So the government's like stepping into the bakery and they're saying, you have to use this kind of flour. You can only work this many hours.
Exactly.
You can only charge this much for a loaf of bread.
Yeah, that baker's going to get pretty frustrated pretty quickly.
They might not make as much bread.
And they might just say, forget it, I'm going to go do something else.
Right. I'm going to go open a tech company.
Become a software developer.
Exactly.
Exactly. So,
Right.
yeah, it's all about striking that balance.
Hmm.
Finding that sweet spot.
And so is there like a
Real world
example of this?
There is a great example, and that is Europe.
Okay.
European countries generally have bigger governments, more regulations than the U.S.
Right.
And guess what? Their productivity growth has been even slower.
Even slower.
Yeah.
So like
It's a laboratory.
they're like the control group
It's a natural experiment.
and things are not looking as good over there.
Yeah, from 1995 to 2019,
Okay.
the U.S. productivity grew by like 60%.
Okay, 60.
France and Germany only saw about 40% growth.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, big difference there.
So maybe too much government can backfire.
It can.
But I mean, isn't the government also supposed to like step in
Yeah,
and help when things go wrong, like during a recession?
that's a really important point.
Yeah.
And to understand that we need to unpack another really important concept, creative destruction.
Okay, creative destruction.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of scary.
It's not as scary as it sounds.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Remember that old clunky phone you used to have?
Oh, yeah.
The one with the tiny screen and the buttons that
Yeah.
stuck?
Yeah.
And then suddenly smartphones came along?
Right.
And everything changed?
And they could do a million things that your old phone couldn't.
Right, exactly. So that's creative destruction.
Okay.
New innovations come along, they replace the old inefficient things.
So it's like a natural evolution.
It is. It's a natural upgrading.
Okay.
And in the long run, it makes the whole system better.
But how does this relate to government intervention?
So imagine if the government decided to keep those old clunky phones alive.
Oh.
They gave huge subsidies to the companies that made them
Oh.
keep making those old clunky phones.
Right.
Sure, it might save some jobs in the short term,
Right.
but it would also prevent the smartphone industry from really taking off.
So by propping up these failing companies or industries,
Yeah,
the government might actually be preventing innovation
they might be.
from happening yet.
Yeah,
Like new, better things.
exactly. They're picking winners and losers, and that's never a good thing.
It's like we're stuck with the old phone
You're stuck with the old phone
when we could have this amazing new smartphone.
with all its capabilities.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay, so that's creative destruction.
that's creative destruction.
And we want to encourage that, even though it's painful sometimes.
It can be painful, but in the long run, it leads to
It's better.
better outcomes for everyone.
Okay, I like that. I
Right.
like that analogy a lot.
Good, good.
So before we went to, I guess, I don't know what to call it before we went to
The next section.
the next section. We were talking about creative destruction and how like the government getting in the way could actually slow it down.
Yeah, exactly. And the book makes this kind of surprising connection between this and like the rise of billionaires.
Okay.
Like when governments intervene, in the economy, it creates this sense of like artificial stability.
Okay. So how does that lead to billionaires?
Well, because instead of focusing on like real, business performance investors start looking at where government money's going.
Oh.
It's like, trying to predict which horse is going to win a race based on who the government's betting on.
Oh, so they're just following the money.
Yeah, they're following the money.
Okay.
And the book actually points out that the number of billionaires has like totally exploded since the year 2000.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. And it's because of like
And government actions might be a big reason why.
government intervention.
Yeah.
So is it like saying that the government is kind of picking winners and losers?
Yeah, they're picking winners and losers.
And then that's creating like fewer big winners?
It creates a system where, a small number of huge companies, often the ones with the best lobbyists,
Right, right.
they end just dominating.
And everyone else is just kind of left behind.
Yeah, it's harder to compete. And,
Uh-huh.
that can stifle innovation.
So all this like, helping the economy stuff might actually be hurting it.
Yeah, this artificial stability, that's what the book argues.
Interesting.
That the government's attempts to, smooth out those ups and downs,
Right.
avoid those big recessions we talked about,
Yeah.
they might actually backfire.
So it's like they're putting out all the little fires,
Right.
but then that leads to like a huge wildfire.
It could lead to that.
Wow. So it's like we're postponing the inevitable.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And, another interesting thing the book highlights is like how millennials view these problems.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Millennials seem to have a very different
Different perspective.
perspective on capitalism and what's wrong with it.
Yeah, they do. And, a lot of millennials came of age during like the Great Recession of 2008.
Right.
They saw firsthand how the financial system nearly collapsed.
Oh, yeah.
Millions of people lost their jobs and homes.
Right. It makes sense. They'd be kind of skeptical of the whole system.
Absolutely. They're skeptical, and they've also grown up, with this rising inequality,
Right.
stagnant wages, climate crisis.
That's
So,
tough, yeah.
and so, a lot of them look at this and they say, you know what? Capitalism's just not working for me.
Right. They want more government
They
help.
want more government. They want more regulation.
Right.
More social safety nets to fix things.
So they're like the opposite of what we were just talking about.
They are. They're kind of the opposite.
They're like, no, we need more government
Yeah.
to fix this.
But the book actually challenges that assumption.
Okay.
It argues that decades of, increasing government intervention might actually be the root cause of a lot of these problems.
So it's like saying that the cure is the disease.
It's like the medicine's making the patient sicker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So how do we know if it's too much government or not enough?
Right. Like, how do we find that balance?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
It's a tough one.
But the book does offer some clues.
Okay.
It argues that the U.S., we're still considered like a leader in, free market capitalism.
Right.
But we've been kind of slowly drifting towards a more like European-style model.
Oh, really? So we're becoming more like Europe.
With bigger government, more intervention.
Huh. Interesting.
And that's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, Europe's economy is not exactly like setting the world on fire.
No, it's not. It's been struggling for a while.
So is that like, trading dynamism for security?
It's a trade-off.
Okay.
And we need to be very careful about which side of that trade-off we want to be on.
So that leads to, something else that's really kind of a hot topic right now.
Yeah.
Bidenomics.
Bidenomics.
So everyone's talking about Bidenomics. What exactly is it?
So Bidenomics is essentially the economic philosophy
Okay.
of, President Biden and his administration.
Okay.
It's, emphasizing a much more active role for the government.
Oh, so it's even more government
It's more government
than what we already have.
than what we already have.
Wow. Okay. So it's like a doubling down
It's a doubling down.
on government involvement in the economy.
Yeah, you can think of it like massive spending programs, targeted subsidies, for certain industries.
Okay.
Even trade barriers.
So instead of letting the free market do its thing,
Right.
the government's like, no, we're gonna step in. We're gonna take control.
We're going to steer this ship.
Okay, but why are they doing that?
So the argument is that like, previous economic policies, particularly those focused on like, free markets and globalization, they haven't really benefited everyone.
Right.
They've left the middle class behind.
Right. People are struggling to make ends meet.
So the government needs to step in, create jobs, invest in infrastructure, promote industries that are considered essential for the future.
Like clean technology and clean energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are big ones
Big priorities.
for this administration.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's also how they're, framing the competition with China.
Right.
Because China has its own heavily state-controlled economy.
So we're trying to beat China by becoming more like China.
That's the irony.
Kind of weird, right?
It is. It's a paradox.
Okay.
And the book points out that China's own economic growth has actually slowed down.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as the government has like tightened its control.
Huh. So maybe that's not the best model to follow?
It raises some questions about, the long-term viability of like state-directed economies.
Okay, but I mean, how are we paying for all this stuff?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Yeah, we're already trillions of dollars in debt.
Yeah, so since President Biden took office, the U.S. has embarked on this massive spending spree.
Spending spree, oh boy.
Yeah,
Oh,
almost $8 trillion in new spending.
8 trillion.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money on everything, infrastructure, COVID relief, military, expanded welfare programs, you name it.
And so how are we paying for it?
Well, the government's borrowing heavily and the national debt is skyrocketing.
Skyrocketing on.
In fact, it's growing much faster than like other developed countries.
And the book is like, this is not a good idea.
The book raises some serious concerns about the sustainability of this approach.
So are we just like hoping for the best?
It seems like we're kicking the can down the road.
Kicking the can, yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what happens when we run out of road?
That's the question that keeps economists up at night.
Okay, so it's not just the immediate impact of Bidenomics.
Right.
It's the long-term stuff.
It's the ripple effects years down the road.
So it's like we're creating a sugar high
We are.
for the economy right now.
Yeah.
But then we're going to crash later.
Could be.
And another thing, we talked about how the U.S. is kind of moving more towards a European model.
Right.
With all this government spending
Yeah.
and bailouts and debt.
With all the intervention.
It seems like we're becoming more like Europe in a lot of ways.
It does seem that way.
So we're traded in our, dynamism for more security, stability.
Yeah.
But is that really a good trade-off in the long run?
I don't know. It's a tough question.
It's a really tough question.
And it's one that, what went wrong with capitalism really tries to grapple with.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic.
There's so much more to unpack.
There's so much more to unpack, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the next section, we'll kind of dive into some of the potential solutions.
Right. Some of the things we can do to actually fix these problems.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
All right, so we're back, and, we've been talking about all these problems with capitalism.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
A lot of, maybe too much government involvement.
Right.
Things slowing down, billionaires getting all the benefits.
Yeah, it's a bit of a doom and gloom picture.
It is kind of doom and gloom, but the good news is
There is good news.
the book doesn't just, tell us all the bad stuff. They actually offer some solutions.
They do. They do.
Okay, so what's the secret sauce here?
Well, it's not like a magic bullet. It's not like you just, snap your fingers and everything's fixed.
Do we just, get rid of the government?
No.
And let the free market go crazy?
No, that's not what they're suggesting. They're not saying, we should have no government at all.
Right.
It's more about, finding the right balance.
Okay.
Making sure the government's doing the things it should be doing,
Okay.
but not overstepping its bounds.
So what are some of the things that they suggest?
So one of the big ideas is that instead of propping up failing companies and industries, we should actually allow them to fail.
Let them fail. That sounds kind of harsh.
It does sound harsh, I know.
What about the people who lose their jobs?
Right, but think about it this way. When a company fails, it actually frees up a lot of resources.
Oh, okay.
Money, talent, ideas.
Yeah.
That can then be used to create new businesses.
So it's like, clearing out the dead wood to make room for new growth.
It's like, that old clunky phone analogy.
Right.
We're letting those old clunky phones die off so that the smartphone companies can thrive.
Okay, so we're embracing that creative destruction.
Exactly.
Even though it might be painful in the short term.
It might be painful, but in the long run, it leads to a more dynamic and innovative economy.
Okay.
And another really important part of this is fostering genuine competition.
So no more picking winners and losers.
No more picking winners and losers. The government should be focused on creating a level playing field.
Okay.
Where, the best ideas, the best businesses, they can naturally rise to the top.
So reduce regulations, lower barriers to entry?
Exactly. Make sure everyone's playing by the same rules.
Okay, but what about things like environmental protection?
Right.
Consumer safety?
Of course, there are areas where government regulation is absolutely essential.
Okay.
We need to protect the public.
Right.
We need to make sure that, businesses are not, polluting the environment or, putting out dangerous products.
Right, so it's not about getting rid of all regulations.
No, it's about being smart about it.
Okay.
Finding that balance.
So less intervention in some areas,
Right.
but smart regulation in others.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. What else is on the list?
Another really important thing is this idea of shifting our focus from, short-term fixes to long-term solutions.
Okay, so instead of just trying to pump money into the economy,
Right.
We need to actually address the underlying problems.
Exactly. We need to think about the long game.
Okay, so what are some of those underlying problems?
Well, things like investing in education and skills training.
Okay.
So, making sure that workers are prepared for the jobs of the future,
Right.
Promoting innovation and entrepreneurship,
Mm,
reforming our tax system,
okay.
making it simpler and fairer, tackling the issue of rising healthcare costs.
Right, that's a big one.
That's a huge one.
Yeah.
So these are big challenges.
There are big challenges, yeah.
It's going to take a lot of political will to actually make these kinds of changes.
Like, we're so focused on, the next election cycle.
Right.
We're not thinking about, the next generation.
Exactly. We need to start thinking about the long term.
Okay.
The future of our country, the future of our economy.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation.
I feel like I've learned a lot,
I'm glad to hear that.
and, it's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Good. That's what we want.
Yeah,
We want people to think critically about these issues.
absolutely.
Engage in these conversations.
And so to that end, I think you have a final question for our listeners.
I do. I do. If, as the book suggests, reducing government intervention is a key to revitalizing capitalism,
Okay.
what specific steps could be taken to achieve this without, causing further harm or instability?
Okay, so how do we right-size the government?
Exactly. How do we find that sweet spot?
That's a great question.
Yeah, something to ponder.
Yeah, something to ponder for sure.
All right.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
See you later. 2 Time 2 Day.